In the last video, we made it really crystal clear that if we ever want to access a table inside of another schema besides public, we put the name of the schema, then a dot, and then the object or the table that we're trying to access. So at this point, that is crystal clear. It turns out that we can actually modify that behavior a little bit. We can change which schema Postgres is going to try to access by default. Let's take a look at a diagram or two and understand what I mean by that. Okay. So right now we have our schema public and our schema test, and they both have a users table. So I want to imagine what really goes on behind the scenes whenever we run a statement like this right here. Select star from users. When you run a statement like that, Postgres is going to first start to say, hey, wait a minute, we've got more than one schema inside this database, and each of these different schemas might have a users table. So Postgres has to make a decision about which schema to use when it tries to execute this command, if we do not specifically specify a schema in there. And in this case, we did not. So rather than just always 100% of the time defaulting to using the schema of public, as I kind of made it sound like in the last video, it turns out that we can actually customize how this question gets answered by Postgres. We can customize which schema gets accessed if we do not specifically designate it when we write out our statement. So to do so, Postgres uses a little setting internally called the search path. The search path controls which schema Postgres is going to access by default if we do not specifically designate it inside of our query. We can print out this search path variable very easily over inside of pgadmin. But let's do it right now. Back over here, we're going to do a show search_path. So you'll notice that it says $user and then public. Let's ignore the $user for just a moment. So ignoring that little variable or that little part of the string right there, focusing just on public, that means that if we ever run some kind of query or some kind of statement, and we mention a table without designating a specific schema, then Postgres is going to default to trying to find that object inside the public schema. So that's what this search path really means. So what does the $user, what is that talking about? Well, remember, whenever you connect to your Postgres instance, you are connecting as a specific user. So if you are on Windows, chances are you are connecting with the username of Postgres. And if you are on Mac OS, you are connecting probably with the username of whatever your username is on your local machine. In other words, I'm really talking about inside of our test file, the user right there. So whenever you connect to Postgres, you are connecting with a very specific username. In my case, it is simply SG. The $user right here means that if we have a schema inside of our database with the exact same name as the user that we are logged in with, then we should try to access that schema first. So in other words, taking my example of having a user of SG, if I ran a command like this right here or a statement like that right there, that means first, if we have a schema called SG, let's imagine this one is called SG, then we should prefer to try to find the users table inside of schema SG. So that's what the $user is really talking about. It is just making sure that if there's a schema named after yourself, let's prefer and try to use objects inside that schema before accessing public. Now, it might seem like I'm going into a lot of detail on what this $user means, but it turns out that's actually going to be a very relevant setting for us very quickly. Let's now try to play around with search path just a little bit. We're going to change our search path manually so that rather than always defaulting to looking for a schema named after ourselves and then public, let's first instead try to get Postgres to prefer to connect to the test schema whenever we do not otherwise specify a schema to use. So to do so, I'm going to update my search path. I'll do a set search path to test and then public. So I'm going to run that. I'm going to comment that out because we're going to undo that setting here very quickly. I ask you, please watch this video to the end because we are going to undo that command we just issued here in just a moment. So now if we do a select star from users, rather than defaulting to finding the users table inside of our public schema, we're going to first try to find the users table inside the test schema first. So I'm going to run that, and now we see results from our test schema instead. Okay, so that is the search path. It controls which schema we're going to find an object in if we do not otherwise designate it inside of our SQL statement. Naturally, if we want to, we can still designate which schema to use. So if I put in public.users, that means go into the public schema, find the users table there. So if I run that, I get results from the public table, or excuse me, the public schema. Okay, so that is the search path setting. So now we're going to undo that change here very quickly. So we're going to do a set search path to double quotes, $user, like so. That reverts our search path to the default setting. Okay, so now that we understand how schemas are searched by Postgres, it all comes down to this search path setting. Let's now start to take all this knowledge around schemas and whatnot and put it together in the next video to really understand how we're going to make sure that all of our different test files somehow connect or use a different schema.